Hi, my name is Diego. I'm a student from Tech Millennium University, and I'm about to talk about the Cold War. The Cold War term was adopted to designate the period that followed the Second World War, where there was a state of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, which caused a sharp separation between the two powers, which caused the fear of the outbreak of a new conflict of characteristics even more destructive than the two previous world wars, since the atomic bomb was already available. The Cold War was divided in six stages. The first one is the containment. By the time the World War ends, most American officials agreed that the best defense against the Soviet threat was a strategy called containment. His famous long-term telegram, the diplomat George Kennan, explained policy. The Soviet Union was a political force committed fanatically to the belief that with the US there can be no permanent modus vivendi. As a result, America's only choice was the long-term patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. The second stage is named the Atomic Age. The containment strategy also provides the rationale for an unprecedented arms buildup in the United States. In particular, American officials encouraged the development of atomic weapons like the ones that had ended World War II. This began an arms race with Russia in 1949. The Soviets tested an atom bomb of their own. On October 4, 1957, a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile named Sputnik was launched into the space. This was the first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to be placed into the Earth's orbit. The Americans weren't going to remain silent, so in 1958 the US launched its own satellite named Explorer 1, designed by the US Army under the direction of rocket scientist Werner von Braun. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong landed in the Moon and became the first man to set foot on the Moon, effectively winning the space race for the Americans. The third stage of the Cold War is named Space Race. The fourth stage of the Cold War is named Red Scare. Beginning in 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee brought the Cold War home in another way. The committee began a series of hearings designed to show that communist subversion in the United States was alive and well. In Hollywood, the committee forced hundreds of people who work in the movie industry to renounce left-wing political beliefs and testify against one another. More than 500 people lost their jobs. Many of these blacklisted writers, directors, actors, and others were unable to work again for more than a decade. The committee also accused the State Department workers of engaging in subversive activities. The fifth stage is named the Cold War Abroad. In June 1950, the first military actions of the Cold War began when the Soviet-backed North Korean People's Army invaded its pro-Western neighbor to the south. Many American officials feared this was the first step in a communist campaign to take over the world and deemed that non-intervention was not an option. Truman sent the American military into Korea, but the Korean War dragged to a stalemate and ended in 1953. The last stage is named the close of the Cold War. Almost as soon as he took office, President Richard Nixon began to implement a new approach to international relations. Instead of viewing the world as hostile, he suggested why not use diplomacy instead of military action to create more poles. To that end, he encouraged the United Nations to recognize the communist Chinese government and, after a trip there in 1972, began to establish diplomatic relations with Beijing. At the same time, he adopted a policy of detente, relaxation, toward the Soviet Union. In 1972, he and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which prohibited the manufacture of nuclear missiles by both sides and took steps toward reducing the decades-old threat of nuclear war. This seemed like the end of the Cold War, but despite the Nixon's efforts, the Cold War heated up again under President Ronald Reagan. Like many leaders of his generation, Reagan believed that the spread of communism anywhere threatened freedom everywhere. As a result, he worked to provide financial and military aid to anti-communist governments and insurgencies around the world. This policy, particularly as it was applied in the developing of world in places like Granada and El Salvador, was known as the Reagan Doctrine. Even as Reagan fought communists in Central America, however, the Soviet Union was disintegrating in response to severe economic problems and growing political ferment in the USSR. Premier Mikhail Gorbachev took office in 1985 and introduced two policies that redefined Russia's relationship to the rest of the world: glasnost or political openness, and perestroika or economic reform. Soviet influence in Eastern Europe waned. In 1989, every other communist state in the region replaced its government with a non-communist one. In November of that year, the Berlin Wall, the most visible symbol of decades-long Cold War, was finally destroyed, just over 2 years after Reagan had challenged the Soviet premier in a speech at Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself had fallen apart. The Cold War ends. The capitalism is a system of ordering the production of goods in which the wealthy classes control the means of production and benefit from the surplus value generated by the workers. That is, they control the surplus once the production costs have been covered, accumulating the monetary wealth to reinvest in various ways. Although capitalism does not find its founder in a thinker but in a productive relations of society, the world wealth of nations granted Adam Smith the title of intellectual founder of capitalism. The socialism is a model that socializes the control of the means of production, giving a good part of them, if not all, to the workers themselves, so that the distribution of wealth is equitable among those involved and the exploitation of men for men. The first representative of the socialism was Count Henry de Saint-Simon, considered by Engels to be the creator of the idea in an embryonic state that would be used by all later socialists, and proposed the federation of European states as a political instrument to control the beginning and development of wars. Hi, today I'm going to interview my friend Pedro. He is 17 years old. I'm going to do this interview in Spanish because he doesn't speak English. Hola Pedro, ¿cómo estás?
Hola, bien, ¿y tú?
Bien, gracias. ¿Me podrías ayudar diciendo tu nombre y tu edad?
Me llamo Pedro Luis de la Mancha y tengo 17 años.
Bueno, Pedro, esto funciona así. Yo te voy a hacer unas preguntas y quiero que me expliques con tus conocimientos lo que piensas acerca de ellas. ¿Está bien?
Está bien.
¿Me podrías decir cuáles eran los países que eran consideradas potencias durante este periodo?
Los países que recuerdo que estuvieron en la Guerra Fría fueron Estados Unidos, Francia, Italia, Alemania, la Unión Soviética y Polonia. Son todos los que recuerdo.
Muy bien. Ahora me podrías ayudar diciéndome el por qué los países que eran considerados aliados empezaron a convertirse en enemigos después de las guerras.
Porque muchos de ellos tuvieron guerras internas, lo que llevó a cambiarse de bando.
Uf, eso suena interesante. Ahora me podrías ayudar en qué lugares exactamente la Guerra Fría tuvo lugar.
Principalmente en Estados Unidos, Rusia y en toda Europa.
Wow, en muchos lugares. Ah, ya estamos por terminar. Solo también ayúdame diciéndome ¿qué opinión crees tú que tenía la gente acerca de la Guerra Fría?
La gente estaba aterrorizada de la posible guerra. Incluso se les enseñaba tácticas de supervivencia a las familias en todo el mundo.
Uf, eso suena triste para mí, la verdad. Pero bueno, como última pregunta, ¿me podrías decir qué tipos de armas tenían las dos potencias a su disposición, ya que acaban de salir de la Segunda Guerra Mundial?
Las armas más peligrosas eran las armas nucleares, ya que apenas se había terminado la Segunda Guerra Mundial y existía incertidumbre acerca de las mismas.
Bueno, Pedro, muchísimas gracias por ayudarme con esta entrevista y espero que tengas un muy buen día. Nos veremos pronto.
Muchas gracias a ti.
For me, the Cold War was one of the periods with more mental torture for families around the world, because the constant uncertainty about possible wars was a horrible matter to endure. However, I also think that it helped a lot to the development of new technologies and scientific progress. With regard to the socialism and capitalism, I believe that each one has good and bad things. Personally, I would like a mixture of both to achieve a more orderly and righteous form of government. For me, this is the end. Remember to drink water and stay hydrated.